Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being here today for our special Halloween event. We are incredibly excited to welcome someone who knows just a little bit about creating Halloween attractions. So without further ado, please welcome Halloween Horror Nights Creative Director, John Murdy. There we go.
Hey, happy Halloween, everybody.
Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. I've done a lot of stuff with the Themed Entertainment Association and Themed Entertainment Association at USC. Hosted you guys at Horror Nights in the past, so it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you. So let's go and get started. Can you start off talking about a little bit about your path into themed entertainment and through themed entertainment leading up to the start of Horror Nights in 2006? Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, 2006. It's kind of a crazy story. So I brought a few visuals along to illustrate it, if you guys can see that on the screen. My entry to this business and to the world of horror started when I was 4 years old. My mom made the mistake of letting me watch the Universal classic horror film from 1931, Frankenstein. Back when I was a little kid, every town had their own kind of horror movie host, kind of like Elvira became in the 80s. And they would always rerun the classic Universal monster movies on television, usually on Saturdays. So I sat and I watched all of Frankenstein when I was 4. And from that moment on, I was just hooked on the classic Universal monsters. So I watched all the movies. I got all the collectibles and action figures. And then I found out, trying to advance the slide there. Let me see if I can do it.
Technology is fun.
Technology is, I know. Can you guys advance it on your end if I do the old book and record thing and go ping? Does it work like that?
That I don't think we can do that on our end unless, let's see, because I don't think we have access to the actual PowerPoint. Is it?
Well, I can. Do you want me to?
If you want to send it to me quickly.
Well, let me see. Hang on a second here. Let's see.
There we go.
How's that? There we go.
Yep.
I figured it out.
Got it.
You have to understand, guys, I'm so old school. I was telling these guys before I got on, I didn't see a computer until I was in high school. So bear with me. But when I was a kid, I quickly realized that like there was a place where you can meet the Universal monsters, and that place was Universal Studios Hollywood. So in 1974, I begged my parents to take me there. And this is actually a picture on the left-hand side of me meeting the Wolfman. I'm the kid lovingly looking at the Wolfman with the really scary, early 70s pants on. I love the expression of the Wolfman in this picture too, because you could just tell this poor actor is just like, Jesus Christ, somebody get this kid away from me. He's following me around the theme park. And then in 77, I can tell it's 77, but because in that picture, if you look really close on the right, I'm wearing a powdered blue Chewbacca iron-on decal Star Wars shirt, because that was the year Star Wars came out. But I got made up at Universal. There used to be a store there that had makeup artists, a lot of them that were movie makeup artists, and they would just make up the guests as part of their daily routine. It's kind of amazing to think nowadays in theme parks, you would actually let a child walk through a theme park with a huge gash on their face. And that's exactly what happened. Like all these parents came up to my mom and dad and they're like, what are you doing? Take this child to first aid. And, I just loved it. It just like from that moment on, I realized like, oh, this is what I want to do. Somehow, some way I want to get into this business. So I did what, most kids do. I started my career as a home haunter in 1977. And believe it or not, the first haunted house I did in my parents' house was Star Wars themed. I am the fan person in that picture. My brother's C-3PO. When Star Wars came out in 77, you couldn't buy any consumer products. They didn't know the movie was going to be such a big hit. So we had to make everything. So we made it all from scratch, and we had a Star Wars haunted house in my parents' house. And I did this from 77 to 81. I did it for 4 years. The image on the right-hand side is the last year we did it. And it got like kind of crazy out of control. Like it would start in my parents', entryway, and then I would go through the bathroom. I would be playing Norman Bates. I would jump out of the shower with a real butcher knife because we just thought like, oh, okay, we need a knife. Okay, let's just take a knife from the kitchen. That kid in the picture with the mask on holding an axe, that's a real axe. And quickly my father basically the light bulb went off, and he came up to me that year and he goes, "My God, we're going to be sued. You have to stop. You can't do this anymore, kid." Because I'd take over like the entire house, the backyard. And the last year we did Halloween in my parents' house, my poor dad looked out the window and there's 200 kids lined up waiting to go through our house. So he kind of, at that point, he told me that, that was it. And that was the end of I thought at that point, that was the end of my haunt career. And then as I moved into like junior high and high school and later college, I really discovered theater. These are really embarrassing pictures, but this is how I got into theater. I played Uncle Sam in my junior high's pageant, I Love America. But that led to an interest in theater, and I eventually auditioned for and got a scholarship for acting. And that's what paid for my college tuition. So by the time I got into college, I also started writing. I wrote a play when I was in college called The Second Coming, and I just self-produced it. And it's kind of like if you guys have ever seen the movie Waiting for Guffman, I invited all these real, Los Angeles drama critics to come to this play. And one guy actually showed up. And lo and behold, at the end of the year, when he did his 10 best plays in Los Angeles for, I think it was 1987 or 88, my little play was listed amongst the 10 best plays in LA. And it was, I still remember the name of the critic because he writes for the LA Times. His name's Glenn Whipp. But Glenn showed up and he reviewed my play and listed it as one of the 10 best plays in LA. So that kind of started my career writing. After I got out of college, I did what a lot of people do who were trying to be an actor at the time. I went to Universal and I got a job as a tour guide. And that's me on the left as a tour guide at Universal. That was 1989. That's when I started with the company. And after doing that for about 2 years, a lot of tour guides, we still do this at Universal. We have a lot of programs for them that allow them to advance through the company and get opportunities along the way. And I got an opportunity to become a production coordinator for what was then called MCA Planning and Development, and now today is called Universal Creative. And the picture on the right, I was a gopher, basically. I was working on the project for the building of the Studio Center, which was the Starway Escalator, the old special effects show that was called The World of Cinemagic. And it was before we even built the ET ride. And so I worked on the Harry and the Henderson sound effects show, The Magic of Alfred Hitchcock, the Back to the Future stage. And part of my job was on Harry and the Hendersons, and that's the image of me on the right. It's a really bad, blurry picture, but I'm basically the sandwich wrangler for the guy who played Bigfoot in the clip we had to film for the episode. So at that point, I thought, great, I'm in the entertainment industry, and I'm specifically in the themed entertainment industry, and I've made it, and I've got my foot in the door. And this is, I'll talk about this for all students out there. This is something you're going to learn in your career as you go along. There's going to be these moments along the way, these kind of checkpoints along the way in your career and your life, where you can either go left or you can go right. And they're kind of these seminal decision points, and you won't really realize it at the time how important it is. But when you look back on it later, you'll realize how important it is. And this is one of those times, because after I finished the job, I thought, I'm in the door, I've made it, I worked my way up, and I got a pink slip at the end of the project, which meant, thank you very much, your job is over. Because back in those days, Universal in the park in Hollywood, they would build a new ride like maybe once every 5 years. And honestly, I mean, they really didn't have any rides. I'm really speaking about like tram attractions, like things like Earthquake. E.T. was the first ride they ever built in the park. And it wasn't like today where you're almost expected to have some new big ride or attraction almost every single year. So they had a very small staff. So I got pink slipped. And at the time I had to make a major decision. Do I go back to work as a tour guide where I have all my friends, or do I keep trying to move forward in this business? And the guy I worked for at the time on the last project, the Harry and the Henderson show, said, hey, there's a company that's starting up a theme park division. And they did industrial theater prior to that. They did big car shows for Toyota and other companies. And they're looking for people. So I went and applied, and I got a job with a company called Kevin Biles Design, later KBD Innovative Arts. And I worked for them from 92 to 95. And I worked with them on a variety of different projects. I have a picture of Elvis up there because I wrote a show for them. And you'll find this out in your career as well. I wrote a lot of projects that never got produced, and this is one of them. I wrote a whole big Las Vegas style show, an attraction with a 360 turning theater that was going to be in the Hilton, I believe, all about Elvis's life. And I flew to Graceland and I met everybody that was ever associated with Elvis Presley. I went to Sun Records when Sam Phillips was still alive. I listened to all the, recordings of, Elvis and Roy Orbison and Jerry Lee Lewis and Johnny Cash. And I wrote this show, and it just didn't happen for various business reasons. Another thing I got to do at Kevin Biles Design is I got to very, very briefly work on the movie Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park, there's a scene in the movie, if you guys have seen it, I'm sure you all know, it's the Mr. DNA sequence where they're kind of Hammond is giving the business pitch for Jurassic Park and how it's going to be this great theme park. And we were hired to design that scene, and we were going to be the second unit that shot it. So for about a couple of weeks there, I worked on Spielberg's Jurassic Park. I had a meeting in Steven's office when we came in and presented our storyboards, which I still have. And again, they decided at the last second that they were going to shoot it themselves, so we didn't end up doing that sequence. And then the other weird thing that happened at that time is I wrote my one and only movie, and it's one of the worst movies ever made. I'm sure if you go on, if it's even on Rotten Tomatoes, it's probably has a terrible rating, and deservedly so. Because these producers came to me at the time and they said, hey, we know your play and we know your writing, and we're looking for somebody like you. We're starting up a production company and we're going to make this movie. And so I went and wrote a treatment, and it was kind of like a coming of age road movie. And I pitched it and they went, oh, this is so great. God, it's fantastic. We can't sell this, but we can sell this. What if you wrote a movie about a hot rock star who was kidnapped by a bunch of hot sorority girls, and the movie was called Rock and Roll Fantasy. And I stupidly said, okay, I'll write this movie. And I wrote it with my writing partner, and it actually got made, and it's one of the worst movies ever made. But the funny part of this story is the guys who made that movie, this was their first movie. They're the guys who made Sharknado years later. They've made all those awful movies, but they've made a whole career out of making movies like that. So here's another one of those turning points. So I worked for Kevin Biles for 5 years, and then the company went out of business. And once again, I was completely out of a job, no idea where I was going to go. But one of the guys I worked for at Kevin Biles ended up at Universal Creative. And he called me in and he said, I can't give you a permanent job, but I have a show that I need a writer for. And it's a Hercules and Xena stunt show. So it was for anybody who doesn't know, there was a television series called Hercules, and there was also a television series called Xena, and they kind of cross-pollinated. So I wrote this kind of Conan-style stunt show that did not get produced. And then I got asked to write another project and another project and another project. And a whole year went by where I freelanced for Universal pretty much nonstop. I wrote, by my recollection, I think I wrote 40 projects, none of which that ever got produced, but worked on proposals, all sorts of different things, whole theme parks that never saw the light of day. But at the end of that year, Universal said, you're here all the time. We have to hire you. You need to be on staff. We can't keep you as a freelancer anymore. So at that point, I joined Universal Creative, and that was 1996. I was with them till 2004. I headed up a bunch of different projects, and I worked my way up from show writer to creative director. My first kind of big project with them was the studio tour, the revamping of that in the year 2000. I also did the special effects stages show. I wrote the early versions of Sesame Street 4D for Japan. I think the only piece of my part of that survived was Cookie Monster versus Monster Cookie, because everything I wrote for it had monsters in it, and it wanted to downplay that. And then I also did the original concept development with a guy named Craig Hanna for Men in Black Alien Attack, and then a former tour guide friend of mine, David Cobb, took that project over, and he was the creative director for it. And then the last kind of major thing I did was Revenge of the Mummy, the ride for Universal Studios Hollywood. And at that point, I got a phone call, and I was in Orlando at the time, because they'd moved the entire Universal creative operation to Orlando. And it was the general manager for the park at Hollywood that I knew when I was a tour guide. And he said, we're thinking of bringing Halloween Horror Nights back. And, we're wondering if you would be willing to leave creative. And at that point, I was a ride designer. I was a creative director overseeing rides. So it was a big deal. and take a, and come back and work with us and bring Horror Nights back. And for anybody who doesn't know, Hollywood has had a very erratic, up until 2006, a very erratic history with Horror Nights. It actually started in Universal Studios Hollywood back in the 80s, and they did it for 1 year, and then they didn't do it, and then they brought it back in the 90s and did it for a number of years. And it kind of was in fits and starts, but by the time I brought it back in 2006, if my memory serves me correctly, I want to say it was 5 years that they've been out of the business. And if you look at Los Angeles, it's the most competitive market in the world for Halloween, events and attractions. There's so many of them, not this year, but normally there is. And so I asked every single person I could think of in Florida, what do you think? People who worked in Horror Nights in Florida. And without exception, every single person said, don't do it. Every single person. So I did it. And I did it because of my love of horror, that going back to what I showed you guys at the beginning, from the time I was a little kid, the Universal monsters have always been my passion. Those movies that Universal made, and doing haunted houses. And so it kind of reawoke in me this thing that existed when I was 10 years old, doing this in my parents' garage, in my parents' house. So I brought Horror Nights back in 2006, and that's
history.
Beginning of it. Yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing it now. We can share it again. Or do you guys want to take it off the screen?
Yeah, I can take it off.
Okay.
There we go. So
there we go.
That must have been a pretty big shift, going from working on theme park attractions and then jumping into Horror Nights. Can you, for people who don't know, kind of talk through the general timeline for Horror Nights and how your general timeline for the year is structured for both like the design, production, and installation?
Yeah, it has changed dramatically from when we started in 2006. When we first did the first event in 2006, there was a maze and a half. And I say a maze and a half because we did one original maze, which was the Asylum. And then there was already an attraction there that was a Von Helsing walkthrough attraction that we just threw a bunch of characters in. And that was the half of the maze and a half. And it was mostly shows and scare zones. And so I think back in those days, I don't think we started working on it till like April or something, because we weren't really sure if we were going to do it. And we really had no idea if we were going to do it a second year. The whole mandate the first year was to just try to make it a business, just try to get our foot in the door.
How was the demand the first year? Was the demand there? Obviously they found that to do it a second year, but.
Yeah, we did 7 nights. The first year, people forget we did 7 nights. That's all Horror Nights was 7 nights. But yes, we realized, oh my God, there still is this demand, even though we haven't done the event in 5 years. So it gave us the shot to do it a second year. And that was really the turning point, because I had kind of a vision or a master plan or whatever you want to call it for what I wanted to do with the event. And that was, I wanted to do what I call living horror movies. I wanted to take the most popular brands in horror movies, and originally it was just exclusively movies in the old days, and bring them to life movie quality, so that if you're, a fan of these movies, you feel like you're living your favorite horror movie. And I knew horror fans, that would be the biggest thing ever for them, because horror is really the bastard stepchild of Hollywood, and it always has been, and it always will be. And I don't mean to be disparaging about that, but it really is the truth. No studio sets out to go, hey, let's make a horror movie, even though they're extremely profitable. Studios are focused on the next superhero franchise, the next mega sequel. Horror is like way, way down the pecking order. But horror fans, and the reason horror is so profitable is because they're like, Star Wars fans or Marvel fans. They're extremely, extremely passionate about the movies that they love. So I knew that was going to be, the ultimate wish fulfillment for a fan. The trick was, actually getting somebody to agree to do it. So in 2007, I flew to New York, where New Line was located at the time. And I pitched them on, at the time they owned Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre in terms of the remakes they were making. And I remember that pitch, the president of New Line said, look, we have people come to us all the time and they want to do Freddy musicals and, Jason roller coasters, and I guess people really did approach them with these things. And he goes, give me one good reason why I should do this. And I said, because we're the studio that invented horror. It's in our blood, and we're going to do this better than anybody else can do it. And your fans are going to freak out when they see it. And he took a leap of faith with me that year because he had no idea. He didn't know me from Adam. He didn't know if we were going to be able to pull this off. And as soon as we did that first year in 2007, Freddie, Jason, Leatherface, it was like, boom, suddenly it went from a little people to a lot of people. And it just exponentially grew year after year after year after year. So nowadays, the timeline is much different. And I actually have some visuals for this. If we can share that again, I'll bring it up on this. I'll take control of that. Give me a second, guys. Okay. So I'll just take you through like what it's kind of like now. And I have a couple of pictures to illustrate. Myself and my partner, who I absolutely need to mention, Chris Williams is my art director and production designer. And Chris and I have been partners since the very beginning. We basically, the way we work is we give each other mutual veto power. So if Chris doesn't agree with something I'm trying to convince him to do, it doesn't go in, and vice versa. We have to like convince each other of our ideas if we have some kind of a creative conflict about the idea. So we've always functioned that way. Chris is an art director and production designer. His education is fine arts. But he has a really, really long history in this business. He did a lot of the mazes back in Knott's Berry Farm in the old days, and he worked in Vegas doing haunted houses even before his Universal days. So he's the most experienced person I know, and the biggest expert in creating haunted houses and what makes a compelling haunted house. So Chris is very involved in the pitch process and deal making, as I am. So typically that begins 12 to 18 these days, 12 to 18 months out from the event. I put this picture in here because this is the rare, and I think it's the only case where somebody actually captured a picture of me actually pitching a maze. And this is backstage in an Alice Cooper concert. That's Alice on the far right. And that's his longtime manager, Shep Gordon, looking at me. And that's Chris in the middle there. And I was backstage. Alice invited Chris and I to his show and hang out backstage afterwards. And we had just done our first maze together in 2011, Welcome to My Nightmare. And so at the backstage after the show, I go, okay, I got another idea. I want to combine Dante's Inferno and your concept album, Alice Cooper Goes to Hell, and mash that together and make a maze. And Alice is looking at me going, what? But he agreed to it. And that's that process happens lots of different ways. Sometimes people come to us. Sometimes we go to them. I mean, I remember being at opening night back in 2010, and Eli Roth, the director, walked up to me and he's like, how come you've never done Hostel? And I was like, because I've never met you. And he's like, well, we should do Hostel. I go, yeah, let's do Hostel. Let's do it. And actually the year we did Alice Cooper, Welcome to My Nightmare, I was sitting at a table we used to have this thing called the Igor Awards, which was this big horror award show we would do opening night every year. And I was sitting at Alice Cooper's table before the show began, and I got a little tap on the shoulder, and this gentleman was standing behind me, and he goes, Mr. Del Toro wants to talk to you. And I was like, oh, okay. Haven't met him, cool. And I walked up to the table, and there's Guillermo del Toro, and he just looks at me and he goes, you and I have a lot in common. And I said, yeah, I know, monsters. I know you. I know you grew up with the Universal monsters just like me. He's like, we need to do something. And I said, yeah, we do. And it took many, many years until we actually ended up working together just because of his schedule and how busy it is. But a lot of times it's just chance encounters, Slash, working with him, he came to see Black Sabbath because he was a huge Sabbath fan. He'd never been to Horror Nights. I got a call one night, hey, Slash is in the park. He wants to meet you. Okay, cool. Go upstairs, talk to him. I take him through Black Sabbath. He comes out the other side. I want to work with you. Let's do something. And I'm like, okay, let's do something. So it happens lots of different ways, but typically it's 12 to 18 months out. Then the way Chris and I used to work before I moved to Ireland, and this made it kind of difficult, but the way we used to work is we would do a concept design session using Post-it notes. And this is a picture of, I think, Insidious in 2013. And for any Horror Nights fans out there, that's the original Halloween Horror Nights poster down at the bottom, or at least part of it, from way, way back, the very first Horror Nights. Which I got framed and never hung in my office. I think it's still sitting there in LA. But in any case, the way we kind of design a maze, concept design goes from about September. So like the event opens in September, and September we start concept design on the next year's event, and it runs to about February. Here's a close-up of that. Basically, how we break it down is scenic, what the scenic is, what the characters are, what the effects or action is, and then because this particular example from Alice Cooper Goes to Hell was a music-based maze, there's a line for music, and we arrange the Post-it notes on the walls of my office, and until we have a flow that we both mutually agree upon. And then the next kind of section before I start writing is visual research. If it's kind of an original maze like Alice Cooper Goes to Hell, even though it was based on an album, it's essentially an original maze. I do a ton of visual research. These are just some random pictures that I pulled that I had in my files when I was doing research on this maze. This particular maze, I mashed up the idea of Dante's architecture of hell as represented in Dante's Inferno, the circles of hell, with Alice Cooper's concept album Goes to Hell. So I was pulling in all these different images. The image on the lower right, that's from Dante's Inferno. The image above it on the right is a nightclub in Paris that used to exist in the 1920s called Hell, which I thought was really cool and kind of inspired our facade. And the image on the lower left is actually a Carney dark ride attraction called Dante's Inferno, and that was kind of my inspiration for the facade as well. But I'll do a ton of visual research that's happening between the months of September and February. And why it's such a wide, time period is because we are leapfrogging from one maze to the next. So while I'm doing one thing and writing one thing, I'm kind of doing visual research on the next thing, and we kind of in a linear fashion bang them out because it's literally just Chris and I. That's, I mean, at this stage of the project, that's the only people doing it. It's me doing all the writing. I write everything, and Chris doing all of the conceptual ground plans and then working ground plans, and he does all of that. He, nowadays he has a team, an art department team, but it's only a few people that work with him. And they're all production designers and people, and then he has some freelance movie and television folks that do elevations for him as well. But it's just the two of us doing all of the creative work. So it's stretched out over a longer period because we have to leapfrog from one to the other. The next phase is the creative treatment, which is kind of my area. I'm the writer. So every maze gets a treatment. It's usually about 75 to 100 pages long. It's partly a narrative that's trying to describe what the guests are seeing, hearing, smelling in some cases, written from the guest's POV as if I was walking through the maze, how it's unfolding in front of my eyes. And then there's kind of a technical breakdown scene by scene that's trying to capture all the different disciplines. So it's props, hand props, scenic, props decor, audio, video, lighting, et cetera, et cetera. This one's just from Insidious in 2013. Now the categories of the technical breakdown are a lot longer and they're a lot more detailed. If it's a movie that we're working on, like Insidious or any other movie, I'll do a full time code log of the film. I'll go through the film, painstakingly. It takes me about 8 hours to break down a film, and I'll log all of the time code, every sound effect, every piece of music, every piece of dialogue that I think I might use in the maze. And then I'll actually write the time code into it so that my audio designers can use that later. If I'm doing visual research on a movie, I'm usually going through 20 to 40,000 pictures per film. So it's a ton of work, and that goes from about the treatment writing phase, starts in December and goes through April. And then while I'm doing all of this, Chris is working on the ground plans. This is an example of a ground plan of his. They're all done by hand drawn. This is a phase that starts with kind of rough ground plans, then tightens it up into the detailed ground plan that goes between October and March. And then, of course, the drawing package, the scenic elevations. This is just an example of a typical elevation from Creepshow last year. The scenic package goes from about November till April. And at that point, and we can stop sharing again because we'll save that for the next section. At that point, about May-ish, we're getting into physical construction. And that goes all the way till, down to the wire till we open the event. And then, lighting and audio and makeup and costumes and all that, those all start up, or at least makeup and costume start up probably May, somewhere around there. So it's more than a year-round process.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I'll talk about the treatment a little bit since you just kind of mentioned that, and you mentioned sound and lighting. So what process did you say, like, your actual lighting designers and audio designers come in with the event, and during that process of creating the lighting packages and sound packages, how hands-on are you during that entire process?
Yeah, Chris and I, the way we work together is we both wear a lot of hats, and so does everybody on Horror Nights. When Horror Nights started, I used to refer to it as the world's largest community theater because it was literally me, Chris, a production manager, a technical director, an audio person, in-house audio person, and maybe a couple other people that were on the team, the actual team. It was like 7 people, 8 people doing everything. And then a lot of vendors, obviously. But with lighting, I'll send them the treatment as soon as it's ready. I'll send it to audio. I'll send it to lighting. We have our own, these days we have our own audio design team in-house. We didn't used to. So they'll probably start up work on it maybe as early as March. They'll start actually putting mazes together. Once I get, what I have to get for them is the audio stems for all of these movies. So that has to be split: dialogue, effects, music. So one of my jobs, because I'm executive producer of the event too, so one of the things I do is I'm always trying to get from whatever property we're licensing the materials we need to do the maze. And it's always things that people, they think they want to provide to us until they understand how complicated it is. Like they'll always go, "Oh, you want some audio from the maze? We can pull some stems." I'm like, "No, I'm going to be pulling hundreds and hundreds of stems. Give me the whole movie. We'll do the heavy lifting, and we'll give, and then, it's just going to save you a ton of time because there's no one's going to want to sit in the bay and do what we have to do with it."
That's something that you initially make the agreements that you come upon, like, we have to have all of
I write it in. I also get really involved in the contracts. I write the creative part of the contracts. Because there's things you absolutely have to have. I have to have access to all location photography on the film. That's why when I say 40,000 pictures, normally when they film a movie, you see, I don't know, a few dozen publicity stills that get released. There's unbelievable amounts of photography done on a movie, even low budget horror movies. And it's usually for continuity. It's for the persons to make sure the glass, when they film the scene is, if it's half empty, when they go back to shoot it 2 days later, it's still half empty. They do so much documentation. There's usually a photographer on the set all the time clicking away. I go through all those pictures, and it can be as much as 40,000, sometimes more.
Wow.
So I've gotten the system down where I'm really, really fast at going through 40,000 pictures. But I'm usually looking for maybe 200-300 pictures that are going to be really important for Chris and our property team to recreate props and set dressing and scenic environments. So that's really what I'm looking for, and makeup and costumes. So I'm hunting for very specific stuff, but it's an awful lot of work just to go through all of that material. But it has to be done, and we kind of insist on it because we're trying to create a movie quality experience, and we want it to live up to the movie to the best of our ability to do so in a temporary attraction.
Yeah, so I was kind of on the temporary attraction note. Obviously, the timeline for a temporary attraction at Horror Nights is very much different than working on a theme park or a theme park attraction. So have there been any opportunities that since 2006 that you've jumped back with the other hat of the more like, oh, I'm working on a theme park attraction?
Yeah.
And what is it like to jump back and forth with those
it is
timelines?
It is strange. I've done it a few times. I've done it on a small scale with things like I created with Chris the Universal experience that used to be in the park. It was basically a movie museum on Universal's film history and television history. So that's more like creating museum design. But then Chris and I did the Walking Dead permanent attraction. So that was very strange after, because I'd started working with Walking Dead, I think in 2012. And we had done 4 mazes. And so in some cases, we were redoing scenes that we had done in a maze, but now we're doing them permanent. And that's, there's a big, big, big difference between a permanent attraction and a temporary attraction. Like the jail, the big cell block scene in Walking Dead, we created that as a maze. And we created it as a permanent attraction, but you're not building it out of steel, when you're building a maze. And the big thing, I think, is animatronics. We had a lot of animatronics in the Walking Dead attraction, and there's so much testing that goes along with animatronics, so much life safety testing, show control systems. that's just hours and hours of duty cycle testing on an animatronic. You have to run it, thousands of times before you can put it in an attraction. And obviously the time to build that and test it is much, much longer. So it's kind of funny. I have worked on rides, none of which I can talk about because they're not out yet. But I have like moonlighted within the company. I've been asked to come help with this or that back with my old cohorts of creative. And it is a really big mind shift. And it actually, the last time I did it, it was very difficult to make that mind shift for me, even though I'd done rides before, because I'm used to working so fast. And I'm also used to working with a temporary attraction budget. So creatively, I don't want to use the word limiting, but it's reality. You have this much time and you have this much money, and you've got to achieve what you're trying to achieve. So the way you approach it is radically different. It's hard for me to do blue sky on a theme park attraction now. It's really hard for me because part of my mind won't allow me to think like that anymore because I'm so used to reality, and particularly the fast-paced, reality of Horror Nights. So it's funny when you are away from it a while and you enter back into that world. The luxury of time just seems crazy to you. You're just like, what? Why aren't we on to the next stage when they're, that's months down the road,
Yeah.
But that is kind of the thing I like ultimately about doing Horror Nights. I mentioned I wrote 40 projects before I ever saw a single thing produced, in creative, and when I first started, and then the ratio got better as I went along. But even so, I mean, you can work on something for years and it never sees the light of day, And the flip side to Horror Nights is everything I write, for the most part, with rare exceptions, is going to get made. But then the sad part of it is, and it's going to get destroyed. It's going to get made. It's going to have a short little life, and then it's going to be gone forever. And that it's kind of cool and sad at the same time.
Yeah, kind of. So going off of the topic, when you mentioned budgets for a bit, because obviously they're very different working on a theme park attraction versus Horror Nights. But one thing that's similar are budget cuts and things always changing. So when you're designing something like Horror Nights with the short timeline that it has, and obviously the target is always going to be moving in any themed entertainment project, how do you go about designing with that in mind from the get-go? And how are things adapted when those inevitable cuts come?
Can I begin with an analogy I love to make about budget cuts for everybody who wants to get into this industry? Because I think it's a really important thing to learn. The analogy I always use about, and this is not unique to theme parks, this is true of pretty much anything in the creative world, whether it's video games or movies or television shows or anything. If you're creating something, right, and it's your thing and you're creating it, you're writing it, it's coming out of your brain, it's kind of a part of you, isn't it? That's why it's so personal, I think, for people that are creative. Creative people are always accused of being sensitive, or it's because it's a part of us. It comes out of us. So I always think of it as like your creative idea or your project or whatever you want to call it. It's like your little baby, right? It's your perfect little baby. And when you're writing it, it's perfect. It's exactly what you want it to be. But once it's birthed and it's born and it's out there in the world, pretty soon somebody is going to come up to you, and this is inevitable. It happens on every single project. It's throughout my entire career, no matter where I was. Someone's going to come up to you and look at your baby, and they're going to go, "It has 2 eyes. Does it need 2 eyes? Couldn't it just have 1 eye? It can still see." And you sit there and eventually you convince yourself, "Oh, okay, yeah, I guess my baby doesn't need 2 eyes," and you pluck 1 eye out. And then someone comes up to you and goes, "It's got 2 hands, 2 arms. Does it need 2 arms? I mean, it could grab stuff with 1 arm. Does it really need 2 arms?" And then you convince yourself it only needs 1 arm, and you cut off the other arm, and then somebody comes along and goes, 2 legs. Come on, that's a bit redundant. Does it really need 2 legs? Couldn't it just hop around on 1 leg? And you cut off the leg. And the point of all of this is this is going to happen to you. It's going to happen to you on everything you ever work on. There's people whose job, because it is business, everything. And I think that's one of the toughest things for creative people when they're starting out. I know it was for me to grasp, is because you want to believe in the purity of creativity. And at the end of the day, there's this thing called capitalism, and unfortunately that is the world we live in, and so there's people who have to look at what you're doing and see, does it really have to be this? Do we really need to do this? Does it have to cost this much? And that's their job. And that's their job as much as it is your job to create it. Right. And the reason I think I became a producer was because I wanted to wield the scalpel when it came time to hack my baby to bits. I wanted to be the one to strategically go, okay, I'm going to cut off its arm. I'm going to try to make it not hurt. I'm going to do it as ethically and as kindly as I can. And I'm going to take out its eye and I'm going to cut off its leg. But I wanted to be the person making those decisions because it's an art form to know how to cut something as much as it is to create something. And that's something you just have to accept as reality, or else you're just going to be designing things for your own pleasure, which is fine. I do things for my own pleasure all the time. But what I've found is it's really hard. You can do your best, what we call a ROM budget or a wild ass guess, and we do all of those things. We try to, when we're designing it, we try to go, okay, like if we're doing, back when we did Alien versus Predator, we were like, oh God, there's a lot of aliens. There's a lot of predators. These are really expensive, and you try to your best. And every time there's going to be oh my God moment of, we can't afford this. We can't do all of this. And you have to cut. Most of the time, the temptation is for a creative person is to, well, I'm just going to take a little bit here, and I'm going to take a little bit there, and I'm going to take a little bit there. And if you're not careful, with that approach, you're just going to water down everything. So sometimes you really do have to hack the baby's arm off, or hack its leg off, or pluck its eye out. Sometimes you just have to go, you know what? I have X amount of scenes, and I want this to be a really good experience. So I'm just going to cut this whole thing. I'm going to cut the whole scene. I'm going to cut every bit of lighting, every bit of audio, and you try to do that as strategically as possible. But sometimes that's just what you have to do. So we try to do our best guesstimates. You try to forecast what things might cost, but the reality is it's always changing. The price of lumber one day and the price of lumber 6 months later can be radically different. It's a commodity. It changes. What industry vendors can charge changes, from year to year to year, depending on how much business they have. So it's really difficult to project it. So it's hard to plan it other than to accept the fact that it's coming and to do it as quickly and painlessly as possible when you have to do it. Yeah. And I hope that answered your question, Dom.
No, definitely. That was a great, thank you so much. So we've talked about hacking the baby. Now kind of jumping back to creating the baby. And when you mentioned it being birthed and maybe not looking the way you initially had thought, writing the treatment. Is there an example of a time that maybe the elevations or what you initially envisioned didn't happen? I'm sure that happens often, if I were to guess. And how do you adapt your treatment like in future years to fix that, or like?
Yeah, I have changed the way I write my treatments. I've gotten much more specific in my treatments, in the technical breakdown side of it. Particularly like, I have like categories for static figures now that I didn't have before. Like, because I remember one year we went, oh my God, we've run through all of our static figures. We were like, what we would call dumpster diving. We were literally going, okay, this guy's, because weird things happen in Horror Nights. Static figures lose their fingers like constantly. People just take them. I don't know why. They just rip them off of figures.
Everyone wants a finger.
Yeah, I guess so. But everything, there's a lot of wear and tear. So your inventory is constantly, we have a lot of stuff that we've accumulated over the years, but you can't, even storing things, is costly. You can't just store things forever. So you're constantly have to making judgment calls. Oh, I'm going to get rid of this, or I'm going to get rid of that. I remember, last year, Pandora's Box, Chris and I were designing that maze, and it was an original maze. And we had, I think it was Medusa. We were going to do Medusa as a character. And we went, oh, remember that maze we did with Alice Cooper, Goes to Hell, that I mentioned earlier? We had these great snake coils that we had, our makeup guy make. And we were going to do this cool Medusa figure and use this. And then all of a sudden, like, we're well down the path, and it's like, up, snake coils, gone. And we have this all computerized now. We have it all, we have the whole inventory. We're like, no. I looked it up, man. It's on the inventory. It's gone. There were things that just, you think you have, and they just aren't there. All of a sudden, fell off the truck. I don't know. It breaks. Things happen, and so I've got a lot more specific with, like, we are always thinking about assets that we can use again, or whether it be furniture or something else, if we can repurpose it. So I've gotten very specific with my notes and my treatments about what it is I'm expecting us to find on that shelf, that I look at the database and see it's in there. Just sometimes just goofy stuff happens, but it's not a mistake on the drawings. It's just, I remember when we were doing, one of the times we were doing Halloween, we were doing the classic scene where Judy Myers' body is laid out on not her body, but her tombstone.
Yeah.
And the body is laying on the bed. And I remember Chris and I walked in, and the tombstone, here's the bed, and the tombstone's like here. It's like floating magically. It's attached to the wall.
Yeah.
And we just both kind of went,
huh.
Why? And we're like looking at the drawings, and we're like, no, it's science, right? But like, why did somebody think that's where that needs to go? It's, mistakes are made in the field. You have to constantly be managing every single, and it's happening and the thing is, it's happening so fast. And it's, so it's understandable, but some guy just decided, tombstone, I guess it goes up here on the wall. And it's like, no. Did you ever see the movie?
So
It's on the bed,
Do you go through, like, because I know how you mentioned in the timeline, you're already designing well as this event is going for the next year. So are there times where you literally walk through and be like, ooh, I need that. Make sure to save that chair. Oh, make sure to save this thing.
Yeah, we tag stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll go through before we strike, because strike is like a bulldozer. It's like everything has to be struck so fast, partially because a lot of the places we occupy are the movie studio these days. And, it's kind of a crazy thing that we occupy, all of this real estate that isn't technically the theme park. It's part of the movie studio. And even though it's the same company, movie studios are constantly renting locations, and, sometimes you think you have a location. That's why we are always moving our locations. You'll notice that they always move around, because one year what might be okay to use, the next year it's like, so-and-so is going to make a film here and can't use it. You're like, oh, so we tag everything. Chris and his team, they go through and they tag everything that we want to try to salvage or save. If it's, you can't really, we save walls, like the physical lumber, to try to, be green and preserve, that product. But a lot of times, like if it's foam work or stuff, it's not going to survive. You can't store rock work, it's chicken wire and spray foam. It's going to just crack and fall apart. But you can, stuff from the staff shops of the movie studio, brick pad. The cool thing is we have a staff shop that makes all the stuff for the movie studio for sets. So you can get all these crazy brick and stone patterns that are fiberglass, and put them on the wall, and then you scenically treat them. So you can try to save those, and they'll go through and they'll tag everything that we want to save, and then anything we don't tag is going to go.
That's great. So I want to quickly circle back.
That's why I never watched Strike. I never have ever watched Strike, ever. I've never
that
set
would be
foot in
painful.
Strike.
That must be hard.
I can't do it.
Yeah.
It's just, it's that thing about your baby. It really is. Anything you create, it doesn't matter whether it's your favorite movie or you're not passionate about, you have to find the passion. You have to find the passion in anything you do, or there's no point in doing it. So everything you do, you care about it, So it's just, I can't watch it. It's just too sad for me. I have my last moment with it the last night that I'm there, and I say my goodbyes to it, and that's it.
Like, we're done.
Yeah.
Kind of circling back a little bit on we were talking about the temporary nature timeline, and I guess that it all kind of was wrapped up in the same umbrella. But when things have to change later on in the process, whether that's an IP gets dropped or a maze has to change, how do you adapt your entire process that we've talked about to fit in a much shorter timeline? Or how do you mobilize your team to do that?
Right. I have a saying. I say, okay, now it's time to get on your horse and ride. It's a saying that we have. It's like, okay, run like hell.
Yeah.
Yeah. When those things happen, and they have, not often, but they have happened. I once made a deal in 24 hours for a property that I needed to get at the last second because we couldn't do something else. I literally was like making a phone call to luckily I know so many people in the horror industry, but I was like, hey, hi, remember me? Hey, we got to do, we're going to do this, but I need an answer by like now, you need to tell me like now, because I got to be designing this like tomorrow, but I've designed mazes in like record time with Chris too. Chris is just, again, he's so experienced and has done this for so long that he's really, really fast. And when we have to do things like that, it's pretty rare, but when it happens, there's no making up for time. There's a certain point in the schedule. There's just the only way it's going to do it is just pure hours of work that are going to do it, and both of us have I can remember, I think it was This Is the End, when we were doing This Is the End. Everything you ever build, whether it doesn't matter if it's a maze or any project, you're going to be at a certain part of the project, you're going to be looking at the progress or lack thereof and be going and panicking. I mean, like if you actually, I always say to people like with Horror Nights, if I actually stopped and thought about it for a minute, there's no way I would be able to do what I do. I would have a panic attack every single day of my life, Chris and I have a saying, and it's, we talk about it as like this huge, massive, giant boulder that we're just trying to, and we have to push it up this huge hill, get it to the top. And at the beginning of production, when we're actually starting construction, it just seems like there's no way you're going to get this boulder to the top of the hill. But the way we look at it, and it's a good way, I think, to look at any project is, if you move it an inch or even that much every day, you've gotten a little bit closer to your end goal. So Chris and I always look at each other and go, did we win today? Did we win? Okay, we won. Good. It was a good day then, even if we got a little bit farther along. But it is such a huge amount of, because, we did 10 mazes in 2019, that's like doing 10, low budget horror movies at the same time, from a production standpoint. That's the amount of work it is. And it's crazy, but I was bringing up This Is the End because they always seem like they're never going to make it, and they always do. It's like, I think Shakespeare in Love, there's the producer in Shakespeare in Love goes, I don't know, it's magic. It's, it just happens. But I remember that particular maze was like, it was the one time I was going, maybe that isn't going to make it, because I actually directed that maze with the cast, with no props, no set pieces, like there wasn't done even close. I mean, I was like going, okay, you possessed Jonah Hill guy, you're going to be on this bed, and I'm sorry there's no bed, and there's no this, and there's no that, there's nothing. I directed the whole maze in an empty set. It's just crazy. But, things like that happen on projects. But I remember one night I was driving around at 2 a.m. on the lot, and I drove into This Is the End, and I think I was delivering bodies to Chris, and it was just me and him. And he was literally painting the set by himself at 2 a.m, and I was bringing bodies for him. I was running around the lot, and we're the only people there, and it was just the two of us because, scenic companies, they come really early in the morning, and they work up to a certain time and they leave, and we were literally just the two of us trying to finish the maze by ourselves at 2 a.m. Yeah.
So you mentioned the 10 mazes, and like obviously from a maze and a half to 10, and not that much of time is insane growth. How do you go about managing and making sure the initial vision for each maze is consistent with a growing set of workers and much larger teams and spread out around an entire theme park and movie studio?
Yeah, that's why it really comes down to the treatment. That's why I spend so much time writing the treatment, and that's why I expect everybody to read it and know it. And I even do evil little tricks. Well, I'll put in something in the treatment that is just completely fictitious, Like at this point, the giant elephant comes into, I'll just write some ridiculous thing. And then in the first meeting, I'll just wonder, like, is anybody going to mention that? Because then I'll know if they read it or not, because you have to read every word of it, because that is the vision, between my written document and Chris's drawing package. That is it. That is the two creators of the event saying, this is what the goal is. This is what we're trying to create. And that document rolls down from the production team to the operations team to the people that are going to be operating the maze, so you try to put it all into what is like the Bible of the whole thing, which is the treatment and the drawing package. You try to put it all there. And then we do really, really long, boring meetings called elements meetings. After the treatment and the drawing package is done, people on our team break it down, and it's down to the nth detail, to where, like, you'll be on, okay, scene 6, blah, 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 blah. There are, 5 chairs and a table with a spoon and going through every single detail, every window, every part of every piece of every elevation. And what we're doing is we're making sure that the assignment of who is building it or securing it, who's the responsible party, is clearly identified amongst all the disciplines. So lighting's in that meeting, audio's in that meeting, all the disciplines are there. And it's making sure that these meetings usually last. We've gotten really good at getting them down to like an hour and a half per maze. But sometimes in the old days, they would go like 2 hours or more. But that's the time where if somebody isn't getting something, or if they can ask a question, and you have the creative director and the art director right there to say, yes, this is, and it's time for me to catch mistakes and Chris to catch mistakes. And we'll go, oh, wait, no, that's not right. That means this should read this, and try to fix before it goes out to all of the different disciplines, to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And you just try to do that with everyone.
So on the subject of the treatment, I wanted to ask, I think you prepared, I'll bring up the slides a bit, to talk about scale a little bit.
Okay.
Because obviously with Horror Nights, translating IPs and movies, you have some massive scenes that are just not possible.
Yes.
So how do you go about determining scale for attractions? I think one of the big questions I had was, do you generally try to choose a certain scale for the entire maze? Like, we want to build everything from this movie, hopefully close to this scale, or how is that generally determined?
Yeah, and it's mostly determined by Chris, because that's his job as the art director and production designer. He's the person, creating the sets. If he needs to reduce the scale slightly, for the most part, he's going to try to stick with that. But for the most part, we're trying to keep the scale 1-to-1 to the movie. It just might be slightly smaller in the footprint of it might be slightly smaller. But really, the honest answer to that is what we can do is dictated by the physical locations that we're in, and particularly like a tent. Like if you're building a maze in a tent has a peak in the middle, and it gets much, much more, less tall at the edges, right? So that's always a trick of Chris's, is if I have a scene that I've put in there that is a big scale and needs height, it has to be in the center if it's in a tent, so then he has to figure out how to get you to the center and then back out again in the context of all the other things he's got to lay out. I'll just show give you an example too, because then it becomes a choice too of how many scenes you do. So here's Ghostbusters, right? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
So that last year we were like, we're going to build Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, which is pretty crazy. Now, obviously, he's not the same scale as the character in the film, which back in those days would have been a miniature set with a guy in a Stay Puft Marshmallow costume, because it was pre-CGI. But it looks like a really massive scene, right? And here's the ground plan. Okay, so that scene, if you can you see my mouse?
Yeah.
So there's the scene, right? And it's in the middle. It's in the center of the tent. It's on the center line where it's the tallest, because his hat's like probably literally almost up to the peak of the tent, But you can see how much space that scene takes up in the context of the entire maze. It's maybe like a sixth of it.
Yeah.
somewhere around there. So that really dictates how many scenes you can do. But you kind of, you can stop sharing because that's that one. But that's really the reality of it is you're in a tent that's X, feet by X feet. So that's it. You can't go out of it. You can't do anything there. So you have to make it work within the height confines of that as well as the square footage of it. Probably there's a couple in our history where I was just like, oh my God, how are we going to, I remember when Guillermo screened Crimson Peak for me and I saw that house, I went, I mean, he did that practically, but that thing was built. Those sets were built. That thing was built. It was massive. And I was just like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? You can't do a facade. You can't, there's certain things you just can't scale. We tried to scale that house and it looked like a doll's house. It looked ridiculous. At first we were like, okay, it's gotta be the facade. We got to figure it. And Chris was like, this is never going to work. It's never going to work. The scale is just ridiculous. And we've tried that with other things too. Sometimes you just have to come up with a different solution for how to get into the maze than the obvious one. And the obvious one is like, oh, it's the house. It's all about the house. We got to go in the house. So for that maze, we focused on the graveyard and we kind of cheated by having you go into a grave and then magically appear in the house. but most of the time he's trying to stick with the same scale that he determines, but he's trying to stay pretty close to the film.
Okay, so I think we have a few questions.
Sure. We
can do those. Here we go. We'll start with this one. What was the most challenging IP to incorporate into the Halloween Horror Nights brand?
That's a good question. It's also the maze that I chased, into the Horror Nights brand. I guess you could answer that a couple of ways. I was going to say The Exorcist because, I chased the rights to The Exorcist for 10 years with Warner Brothers. I was the guy that kept asking every year. And I started to believe that there was that they had this negative in a vault with priests surrounding it or something. And we're never going to let it see the light of day or something. But eventually I was able to get the rights to it. But at that moment, once I just wanted it so bad and chased it so long that I never actually took the time to think about how to do it. It's just because to me, it was the scariest movie ever made and still is by far. Nothing even comes close in my opinion. And then when we got the rights, I suddenly turned to Chris and I went, oh my God, it's a movie about an 11-year-old girl that never gets out of bed. Every scene is in the same bedroom, Chris. Every scene is every seminal. If you go through that movie, the levitation scene, the 360 head turn, everything you would want to try to recreate is the same room. So in that particular maze's case, what was there's always these moments of inspiration, these kind of aha moments or hallelujah moments where you just go, I know what to do. When I was a kid, there was something called the banned trailer for The Exorcist. Because back in the 70s, and The Exorcist was 71, 73. I can't remember right now, but it was early 70s. I was a very little child, and I saw this trailer on TV because back then you could show cigarette commercials in between Scooby-Doo episodes. It was really weird. But the reason it's called the banned trailer is because it used subliminal images. Almost, it was accused of that. It was kind of inverted images of Reagan's face and Pazuzu in particular, the demon that almost subliminal in the film. He flash frames all the time. And they had just a voiceover and these weird negative images going, bah, bah, bah. And they pulled it because people were claiming it was subliminal and all this stuff. But I remembered that and I went, that's the solution. We're going to do this bedroom multiple times. You're going to go into the same damn room over and over again. But in between, we're going to make you feel how I felt when I was a little kid watching that trailer. We're going to make you feel like you're being possessed by Pazuzu, the demon, in total darkness using, these kind of strobe light bursts and different techniques to make you just feel really disoriented. So that one, I think for sure was the most challenging from a creative standpoint of how to just design it, fit into the brand. I like to take chances with properties that seem like they have no business being in a horror event. To me, that's like an interesting challenge. So like Ghostbusters, to me, I had no doubt about how to do it. But it certainly is like kind of running counter to the brand. The brand is, horror, especially originally it was just hardcore horror. But I like trying to do different things. That's why we did This Is the End. Once I met James Franco at the event, and I thought the movie was so outrageous, and it had a lot of great horror elements when you really looked at it. I was like, God, this is so outrageous. I just want to do it, So you just got to hope people accept it, and I don't think horror is one flavor. I think people like to think of it as one flavor, but it's not, Killer Clowns from Outer Space is as much a horror movie as The Exorcist, So hopefully that answered your question.
So next we have, we saw in the last few years the integration of smartphone games for guests. Do you see further integration of these at the event? And is this a possible avenue for interactives within the haunts?
I'll answer that two ways. Yeah, I've done a lot of stuff with, messed around with a lot of technology things last few years. What's difficult about them is, the just reality of a large theme park event is throughput, right? You have to get X amount of people through an experience per night to ensure that the vast majority of the people can see what you're creating. Interactive is a really tricky thing for a maze where you have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people, going through it, because you're asking them to make a choice, right? And even though it's super cool and I love it, the effect it would have on the lines, because you always have to think about throughput is like water through a hose, right? The minute you put a kink in the hose, everything downstream of that builds up just like it would in a garden hose if you did this. So if you've got somebody going through and it's like, oh, I just got the magic code and I'm in this scene and now I have to do something, everything slows down behind you. And what that means is your lines get longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. So it's tricky to do in a maze itself. But things like in the queue lines is a great opportunity to do that kind of thing. And we have done some things like that. And I think augmented reality, there's all kinds of things you can do with augmented reality that is really cool. And hopefully you'll see that in the future. But the tricky thing that I keep struggling with is mazes, because, mazes do more capacity than almost any ride, like you think of the biggest, e-ticket theme park rides, we do more capacity in a maze in an hour than they do, because we have to, and that's the nature of walkthrough attractions. That's why they do so much capacity. So it's a really tricky thing. Phones, I have a love-hate relationship with the cell phone in mazes. I hate this. This is what I hate more than anything else in the world, watching somebody go through a maze like this. Right? Because I'm like, my God, you have eyes. I know why they're doing it, because they want to, they want to keep the memory of it. They want to have a document of it, because they're not going to be able to see it any other way. It's never going to look the way it looked when they see it with their eyes, because this is not going to be able to film it in low lighting the way a maze is lit to look anything like what a maze is supposed to be, to look like.
Can I ask you a follow-up question with what you just mentioned? Yeah. Has obviously the emergence of cell phones has gotten, and like the camera cell phone has gotten better and better, and everyone now wants to videotape them going through the maze, or Instagram, Snapchat, it's everywhere. Has that changed at all the way you design certain things, where you think like, oh, this will look great, but from a PR perspective, like that's not going to show up well when every single person has their phone? Or do you just not?
No, I don't give it a second thought. I don't, you're not even supposed to like do it. It says like you can't film in the maze. But you know what? That's like trying to take candy away from a child. It's like, it's so prevalent in our society. People are always going to do it. There's no way you're going to tell them not to do it, so you have to just kind of accept it. What I don't like about it is it does ruin the experience for people. Like, there's nothing more frustrating than walking through a maze where someone in front of you is trying to go, and you're just trying to see it for the first time. And it's, it's slowing the person, or it's not allowing the person behind them to experience it the same way. So it bothers me on that aspect. But no, we don't try to light our mazes for cell phones. We try to light our mazes for the eyes, because that's why God gave them to you.
Sorry, let me grab. Here we go. Next question is, if someone wants to join the HHN team, what is the best way to get one's foot in the door? I'm sure you get that one a lot.
Yes, all the time. One of the cool things about Universal is they've always been really good about promoting from within, and giving opportunities to people to get their foot in the door. One way we do that at Universal that I think is really great is we have a PA program, or production assistant program, and it's specifically designed for frontline employees. They can apply to be interviewed and get into a production assistant pool, and they can get assigned to temporary assignments to work on projects, not just Horror Nights, a whole bunch of projects in the entertainment department. And a lot of people that are on our team that have moved up on our team started that way, and they got in the door that way. I mentioned Chris in his art department. One of the people on that art department started exactly that way. Some of our project managers, who are like senior project managers now, started that way. So that's one way. I think for just the haunt industry in general, I think theater is a great, speaking just purely educationally. Nowadays, you can actually, in some colleges, you can actually study themed entertainment design. You couldn't when I was, in college. There was no school for it whatsoever. And I was a theater major. But when I look back on it, theater was a great education for this business, because all of the disciplines that you use in theater, lighting, audio, directing, walking, costumes, makeup, sets, props, all of those things are things we use in Horror Nights. And when you really break it down, Horror Nights is theater. That's what it is. It's live theater. It's a really weird, freaky, tweaked form of live theater, but it is live theater nonetheless. So I always think, even if you're, speaking to somebody who's like maybe just starting to try to figure out what they even want to study or go, I think even just like volunteering or working even at a community theater level is good to do it. I think just getting haunt experience, even if it's, again, volunteering, there's, haunts that are volunteer basis, just getting experience of what it's like and being around it, I think is very valuable too. And then there's, on the more professional level, there's USH Jobs is the site where they post all jobs that come up for Universal across the board. And then for internships, there's a program through NBC Universal called Campus to Careers. And it's a serious like college internship program. You have to be earning college credits, but it all runs through NBC Universal, and it's called Campus to Careers. So you can look into that as well. But
do you guys usually ever get people from that program into like your Horror Nights bubble, or is it usually just more on the Universal Creative?
It's Universal Creative. It's television, it's film, and I'd say maybe more on the marketing side for those. But occasionally we have. Usually Horror Nights is kind of a weird beast for them to fit it into their schedule because of the way it works. But the vast majority of people who've gotten into, other than people that are, have a ton of experience, because obviously the people who work on Horror Nights are experienced people. They've been doing this for a long time. They have a lot of, whether, even if they're not in the haunt industry, their theater or television or film credits are pretty extensive. But that's why I mentioned, the people who worked at Universal that came up through our production assistant program is pretty impressive to me, how many people started out as a PA. And a lot of them, we just found that they had, certain people started as a PA, and then we just found out, oh, you studied design in college, you have a degree in this. They just that's how they had to get their foot in the door, was literally working at Universal in a different capacity. And then, Chris ended up finding them and hiring them to be in his art department. We have a character who is one of our designers, who he kept coming up to me during, I remember he came up to me once, and at the time I thought it was kind of inappropriate, because he's like, I've got a portfolio, I want to show you my and I was like, whoa, kind because there's so many things you can't look at when you work in this industry. You can't, just like in the movie industry, you can't send a script to a studio and expect them to read it. They'll never do that. They'll mail it back to you because it's liability, But when I actually got to talk to this guy and got to know him, and Chris in particular, realized, like, Jesus, this guy's got a serious education in design. He's got serious chops. And so he works as one of our production designers every year, but he still works as this character. And that's the funny thing, is that he loves doing that so much that he always wants to work as a performer, in addition to, he works part of the year for us as a production designer, and he works the event and has for several years as a performer.
So we'll go ahead and wrap it up with one final question. And
sure.
You've kind of touched on this, but we've asked it to everyone. And I will say, because of the nature of how things have been this year, it's been fascinating to see how the answers have evolved throughout panels throughout the year. But do you have any advice for current students that hope to get into the theme entertainment /or haunt industry? And I know that's kind of a tricky one, and you kind of touched on it, but especially given the times. But I wanted to ask that.
No, it's cool. It's funny. My dad, who is 84 and has worked for the same company for 60 years, which is probably never going to happen again in anyone's lifetime, and doesn't have a creative bone in his body. And I say that with love in my heart for my father. It's just not who he is. He had, 3 sons, 2 of which are musicians, professional musicians, and 1 who's a carny, me, and I say that with all seriousness too, because that is essentially what I am. I am a carny. I come in. That's where our business came from. That's who we are. We are show people, but start to be a kid, now be a parent and have little kids. That must have been terrifying for my father, to have kids who aspired to do things creatively in life, and had jobs that were aspirations that were very risky, that, a lot of people don't get the chance to do, frankly. He gave a piece of advice to all 3 of his sons. And my sister's in social service, and she, works with people with addictions and stuff, and God bless her. But she didn't, her aspirations were different. But his advice was real simple. It was like, whatever you do in life, do it to the best of your ability. It doesn't matter if you're flipping fries at McDonald's, whatever job, step along the way you're doing, do it to the best of your ability. Make sure you're the best damn fry flipper, the best damn fill in the blank. Because quality rises to the surface, and people will notice that, right? And that's how you're going to get ahead in whatever you decide to do, right? That's probably the best advice I ever got in my entire life, as far as my career. And it came from somebody who knew nothing about what to tell me about how to get into this business. Because when I look back on my career, whether I was a tour guide at Universal, specifically in the entertainment, themed entertainment industry, or a production assistant, or a production coordinator, all the steps along the way to get to where I wanted to get. The reason I got an opportunity along the way, all those little checkpoints I talked about earlier, where you could go left or where you could go right, was because somebody cared enough to recommend me for another position somewhere else, or in the same company. But it's a big deal when you recommend somebody, when you say, hey, I think you should hire X, because that's your reputation you're putting on the line, right? People won't just do that unless they really believe that you're going to do a good job and you're not going to make them look bad, So in retrospect, it was incredibly good advice. And it served me really, really well. I think it's important to understand, let's say, just the haunt industry, or any part of the themed entertainment industry. It's important to know it from the ground up. I think I gained a lot of knowledge being a tour guide. And when I was a tour guide, I was also, a tour guide trainer, and then I was a VIP tour guide. I was Michael Jackson's VIP tour guide once upon a time. But I also was like kind of like an operational assistant manager, where like I was in charge of a certain part of the theme park during the summer months. I learned a lot about this industry from that. And what I think it gave me was a little bit more of a reality base to my work. I always think of myself as a creative realist. When I design stuff, I think a lot of people make this mistake when they're starting out, is I tend to design things that I know are going to work, both creatively and operationally. And I think those are equally important things. If you design not that I haven't made mistakes, I've made a million mistakes, but if you have that basis in understanding how a theme park operates, or how a haunt operates, how it really operates, what an actor can physically do. And I've played, one of the things I used to do till I got too old to do it is I would go and put on the costume, and I would go play Michael Myers for a night, to really understand what you're asking your actors to do. Because it's hard work. It's really hard. It's hard to be a character. What we ask them to do, they're going to do it 100,000 times during the course of the event. The same repetition, do anything 100,000 times, and it's exhausting. So it's really, I worked my way up the ladder from tour guide up to here, right? Most people don't want to do that. They just want to, I just want to go to here, but you really need to know the basics of how these things function to be able to design for them. At least I believe that. So hope that answers your question.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for all of this. This was incredible. Thank you everyone for watching, and that will conclude this. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and happy Halloween to everybody out there.
Happy Halloween, everybody.